The first few weeks of Mark Sterling's marriage to Sarah Reynolds felt like stepping into the pages of a storybook, the kind his mother used to read him, where everything was bathed in a warm, unwavering light. Their wedding, a tasteful affair at a charming vineyard just a month prior, on a sun-drenched Saturday in early June, was still a vibrant, joyful echo in their sun-filled apartment. Mark, a man who had always considered himself a pragmatist, an architect who dealt in blueprints and solid foundations, found himself utterly swept away by a tide of domestic bliss he hadn't known he was missing. Sarah, with her quiet laugh that crinkled the corners of her hazel eyes and her gentle, almost ethereal presence, had transformed his meticulously ordered bachelor pad into a home, a haven. He'd find himself just watching her sometimes, as she hummed a nameless tune while arranging wildflowers in a vase, or curled up on the sofa with a book, her brow furrowed in concentration, and a wave of profound contentment would wash over him. This, he'd think, this is what happiness feels like. This is what forever is supposed to be. The husband, a role he cherished, felt like the luckiest man alive. They had decided against a lavish honeymoon immediately after the wedding, opting instead to settle into their new life together, to savor the simple rhythm of shared mornings and quiet evenings. They planned a trip to Italy for their 6-month anniversary, something to look forward to. In the meantime, life was a gentle unfolding of shared meals, lazy Sunday mornings spent reading the paper in bed, and discovering the small, endearing quirks that make two individuals a couple. Sarah, however, seemed to tire more easily than he remembered from their whirlwind courtship. She'd attributed it to the stress of wedding planning and the adjustment to married life. Mark, eager to be the supportive husband, hadn't questioned it much, ensuring she rested, bringing her tea, and handling more of the household chores. He loved taking care of her, it felt like a natural extension of his vows. Then came the incident that pricked the iridescent bubble of their newlywed bliss. It was a sweltering Tuesday evening in July. They were hosting their first small dinner party, just a couple of Mark's colleagues and their wives. Sarah had been her usual charming self, though Mark noticed she seemed a bit flushed, perhaps a little more subdued than usual. As she was clearing the dessert plates, she swayed almost imperceptibly. Mark, attuned to her every nuance, was instantly by her side. "You okay, honey?" he murmured, his hand on her arm. She smiled, a little too brightly. "Just a bit warm in here, I think." A moment later, as she turned from the sink, her eyes suddenly lost focus, her face went a ghastly pale, and with a soft sigh, she crumpled to the kitchen floor. The convivial chatter in the dining room ceased abruptly. Mark, his heart leaping into his throat, was kneeling beside her in an instant, calling her name, his voice sharp with a sudden, terrifying panic. One of his colleagues, a pragmatic engineer named Bill, was already dialing 911. Sarah's eyelids fluttered open within a minute, a look of profound confusion on her face. What happened?" she whispered, trying to sit up. The paramedics arrived with an almost unnerving speed, their calm professionalism a stark contrast to the alarm thrumming through Mark. They checked her vitals, asked a series of routine questions. Sarah, embarrassed and insisting she just felt a bit faint from the heat and perhaps hadn't eaten enough, declined to go to the hospital. The paramedics, seeing she was now alert and her vitals stable, advised her to see her doctor the next day, just to be safe. The dinner party ended awkwardly, their guests departing with hushed words of concern. Mark, his earlier contentment shattered, helped Sarah to bed. She seemed shaken but insisted she felt fine, just tired and a little mortified. "It was probably just one of those things, Mark," she said, trying to reassure him, and perhaps herself. "Too much excitement, not enough water on a hot day." But Mark couldn't shake a profound sense of unease. It wasn't just the fainting spell itself, it was something in her eyes when she'd woken up on the kitchen floor, a flicker of something he couldn't name, fear, perhaps, or something deeper, more hidden. The next day, he insisted she see Dr. Peterson, their family physician. Sarah reluctantly agreed, still downplaying the incident. Mark accompanied her, a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. Dr. Peterson, a kindly man in his late 50s, conducted a thorough examination. He asked Sarah about her general health, any unusual symptoms. Sarah mentioned feeling more tired than usual lately, some occasional night sweats, which she'd attributed to the summer heat. Dr. Peterson listened, his expression thoughtful. He recommended a battery of blood tests, just to rule out anything straightforward, like anemia or a thyroid issue, he explained. Standard procedure after an unexplained fainting episode. Mark nodded, trying to take comfort in the doctor's calm demeanor. But as they left the clinic, Sarah's hand clutching his a little too tightly, he couldn't escape the feeling that a shadow, cold and unwelcome, had just fallen across their sunlit new life. The wedding, the joyous husband, the radiant wife, these images now felt fragile, threatened by an unknown that had just made its ominous presence felt. The word HIV was nowhere near his conscious thought, not yet, but the seed of a nameless dread had been planted. The week that followed Sarah's fainting spell and her visit to Dr. Peterson was thick with an unspoken tension. Mark tried to maintain an air of normalcy, throwing himself into his architectural projects, but his mind was a constant loop of worry. Sarah, for her part, seemed to retreat further into herself. She was quiet, often lost in thought, her earlier easy laughter now a rarity. She still insisted she felt fine, just a little tired, but the shadow in her eyes, that fleeting expression of fear Mark had glimpsed on the kitchen floor, seemed to have taken up permanent residence. He found himself watching her covertly, cataloguing every sigh, every moment of fatigue, his anxiety coiling tighter with each passing day. The husband who had so recently reveled in carefree bliss was now a man on edge, waiting for a phone call, for a piece of paper, that might change everything. The call from Dr. Peterson's office came on a Friday afternoon, a week to the day after Sarah's tests. The nurse on the line was polite but firm. The doctor wished to see both Mark and Sarah to discuss the results. Is everything okay? Mark asked, his voice betraying a tremor he couldn't control. The nurse's noncommittal response, the doctor prefers to discuss these matters in person, did little to assuage his growing dread. He hung up the phone, a cold fist clenching in his stomach. He found Sarah in the living room, staring out the window, her back to him. When he told her about the doctor's request, she didn't turn around, didn't speak for a long moment. Then, in a voice so low he could barely hear it, she simply said, "All right." The drive to the clinic was a silent, suffocating affair. Mark gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. Sarah sat beside him, a small, distant figure, seemingly lost in her own impenetrable thoughts. He tried to make small talk, to ease the palpable tension, but his words fell flat, absorbed by the heavy silence. Dr. Peterson's consulting room, usually a place of calm reassurance, felt like a judgment chamber. The doctor, his kind face etched with an uncharacteristic gravity, gestured for them to sit. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He looked directly at Sarah, then at Mark, his gaze steady, compassionate, yet unyielding. "Sarah, Mark," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "we've received the results from Sarah's blood work. And I'm afraid I have some difficult news to share." Mark felt his breath catch, his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs. He reached for Sarah's hand, it was ice cold, trembling slightly in his grasp. Dr. Peterson continued, choosing his words with care. "Sarah, one of the tests we ran, a more comprehensive screening panel due to some of the symptoms you described, the fatigue, the night sweats, the fainting, has come back positive for the human immunodeficiency virus. HIV. The three letters hung in the air, stark, brutal, incomprehensible. HIV. Mark stared at the doctor, then at Sarah, his mind struggling to process the information. It felt like a punch to the gut, knocking the air from his lungs. He saw Sarah's face crumple, her eyes, wide with a terror he now understood, filling with tears. She let out a small, choked sob, her hand tightening convulsively on his. "No," Mark whispered, shaking his head, a denial rising instinctively. "No, there must be some mistake. Sarah, she's not, this can't be right." Dr. Peterson's expression was one of deep sympathy. "I understand this is a profound shock, Mark. We've run the confirmatory tests. There is no mistake. Sarah is HIV positive. He then turned his attention primarily to Sarah, explaining the diagnosis, the implications, the available treatments, the importance of ongoing medical care. Mark listened in a daze, the doctor's words a distant, meaningless drone. His entire world had just imploded. Sarah, his wife, the woman he loved, the woman he had built his future around, was HIV positive. The wedding, their vows, their shared intimacy, all of it was now cast in a horrifying new light. A wave of nausea washed over him, followed by a cold, sickening dread. Betrayal. The word screamed in his mind. She had known. She must have known. This wasn't something that just happened overnight. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Peterson gently suggested that Mark, as Sarah's husband, should also be tested for HIV as a precautionary measure, given their intimate relationship. The recommendation, though medically sound, felt like another blow. The appointment concluded with referrals to specialists, pamphlets filled with information that Mark couldn't begin to absorb, and a heavy, suffocating sense of despair. The drive home was even more silent than the drive to the clinic, but this silence was different. It was no longer just tense, it was fractured, poisoned by the devastating truth that now lay between them. When they finally got back to their apartment, the place that had so recently been their haven of happiness, Mark turned to Sarah, his face a mask of pain and disbelief. "When?" he asked, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. "When were you going to tell me, Sarah? Or weren't you going to tell me at all?" Sarah stood before him, tears streaming down her face, her body racked with sobs. "Mark, I didn't know how," she choked out. "I was so scared. I found out, a while ago, before the wedding. I wanted to tell you, I swear I did, but I was terrified of losing you. I thought. I hoped." Her voice trailed off, her excuses sounding feeble, pathetic, even to her own ears. "You hoped?" Mark's voice rose, incredulity lacing his tone. "You hoped? You married me, Sarah. You stood there and said those vows, knowing this? Knowing you were putting my health, my life, at risk?" The sense of betrayal was a physical ache, a gaping wound in his chest. The love he felt for her was still there, a confusing, agonizing counterpoint to the burgeoning anger and the terrifying fear that was beginning to consume him. His wife. His HIV-positive wife. And he, her husband, was now standing on the precipice of a nightmare he had never, in his darkest imaginings, conceived. The first shockwave of this catastrophic revelation had hit, and Mark Sterling was reeling, his life, his marriage, his future, all teetering on the brink of utter devastation. The days following Sarah's HIV diagnosis, and her devastating confession that she'd known before their wedding, were a blur of raw, conflicting emotions for Mark. The initial shock had given way to a maelstrom of anger, profound grief, and an all-consuming, terrifying fear. Fear for Sarah, certainly, for her health, her future, the life sentence this diagnosis represented. But an even more immediate, more visceral fear now clawed at his own insides, the fear that he, too, was infected. Every shared kiss, every intimate moment, every loving touch during their courtship and their brief, tragically truncated honeymoon period, now replayed in his mind as a potential vector of transmission. The husband who had pledged, in sickness and in health, was now confronted with the sickening possibility that his wife's sickness had become his own. He moved through their apartment like a ghost, the silence between him and Sarah thick with unspoken accusations, with a grief so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on them. Sarah was a wreck, alternating between periods of inconsolable sobbing and a numb, hollow-eyed despair. She tried to talk to him, to explain further, to beg for his forgiveness, but Mark found he couldn't listen, not yet. The betrayal felt too fresh, too monumental. His own survival, his own health, had become his immediate, overriding concern. Dr. Peterson's gentle but firm recommendation that he get tested for HIV echoed relentlessly in his ears. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an imperative. He made the appointment for his own blood test the very next day, his voice a strained monotone as he spoke to the clinic receptionist. The actual process of having his blood drawn was quick, clinical, impersonal. But the wait for the results, a full week, the clinic informed him, stretched before him like an eternity of torment. Each morning he woke with a jolt of anxiety, his first conscious thought a prayer, a desperate plea to a God he wasn't sure he still believed in. He found himself obsessively cataloging phantom symptoms. Was that a new ache in his joints? Was he feeling unusually fatigued? Was that a swollen gland in his neck? His mind, usually so rational, became a breeding ground for hypochondriacal fears, every minor physical sensation magnified into a potential sign of infection. During that agonizing week, his relationship with Sarah, his wife, existed in a strange, suspended limbo. They occupied the same space, but it felt as if an invisible, impenetrable wall had risen between them. He slept in the guest room, unable to bear the thought of sharing a bed, the sight of their now terrifyingly compromised intimacy. Meals, when they ate at all, were silent, tense affairs. He looked at her, the woman he had loved so deeply, the woman who had shattered his world, and felt a confusing, painful mix of emotions, a lingering tenderness that warred with a furious sense of betrayal, pity for her plight juxtaposed with a burning resentment for what she had done to him, to them. The wedding photos that still adorned their living room walls, images of their smiling, hopeful faces, now seemed like cruel mockeries, relics from a life that no longer existed, a dream that had imploded. He tried to research HIV online, to understand the virus, the modes of transmission, the prognosis. But the information, clinical and stark, only fueled his anxiety. He read about viral loads, T-cell counts, opportunistic infections, a terrifying new vocabulary that threatened to define his future. He thought about the stigma, the fear that had surrounded HIV/AIDS during his younger years, the images of suffering and discrimination that were seared into the collective consciousness of his generation. Could that now be his reality? The husband, the architect, the respected member of his community, could he now become one of them, one of the afflicted? The thought was unbearable. The day he was scheduled to receive his results dawned gray and oppressive, mirroring his internal state. He drove to Dr. Peterson's clinic alone, his hands clammy, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He sat in the waiting room, the minutes stretching, a silent scream building in his chest. When Dr. Peterson finally called him in, Mark could barely meet his eyes. The doctor's face was somber, his usual kind smile absent. He gestured for Mark to sit, then took a deep breath, the kind doctors take before delivering news no one wants to hear. "Mark," Dr. Peterson began, his voice low, "I have your test results here. And I'm so very sorry to have to tell you this. The test has come back positive for HIV." Mark heard the words, but his mind refused to accept them. It was as if the doctor were speaking a foreign language, the sounds disconnected from any comprehensible meaning. Positive. He was HIV positive. The room seemed to sway, the doctor's face blurring before his eyes. A roaring sound filled his ears, drowning out everything else. This couldn't be happening. Not to him. He was careful. He was healthy. This was Sarah's illness, Sarah's secret, Sarah's betrayal. How could it now be his? But there was no denying the quiet finality in Dr. Peterson's voice, the profound sympathy in his eyes. The second shockwave, even more devastating than the first, crashed over Mark, threatening to obliterate him. His wife had lied to him, had knowingly exposed him, and now, his worst fear had been realized. He was infected. His life, as he knew it, was over. The future he had envisioned, a future with Sarah, perhaps a family, a long and healthy life, had just been violently, irrevocably erased. The wedding vows, in sickness and in health, now had a ghastly, literal meaning he could never have foreseen. The husband, once betrayed, was now also a victim of the disease itself, his body a battleground, his future uncertain, his heart a shattered ruin. The silence in Dr. Peterson's office was broken only by Mark's ragged, disbelieving gasp, the sound of a man whose world had just ended. Mark drove home from Dr. Peterson's clinic in a daze, the doctor's grave words, "positive for HIV," echoing like a death knell in the hollow chambers of his mind. The vibrant colors of the late summer afternoon seemed muted, distorted, as if he were viewing the world through a thick, grimy film. Each familiar landmark, each tree-lined street, felt alien, part of a life that was no longer his. He was a condemned man, sentenced not by a court of law, but by a virus delivered to him through an act of profound, intimate betrayal by his own wife. The love he had once felt for Sarah, the tenderness, the dreams they had shared during their wedding and courtship, had curdled into a toxic brew of despair, white-hot rage, and a terrifying sense of utter annihilation. When he walked through the door of their apartment, the place that was supposed to be their sanctuary, it felt like stepping into a mausoleum. Sarah was there, in the living room, her face pale and tear-streaked, her eyes wide with a mixture of trepidation and a desperate, fragile hope. She must have known, from the moment he walked in, from the look on his face, a look of such utter devastation it was almost inhuman, that his news was the worst possible. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling, what did he say?" He didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, in the doorway, looking at her, this woman who had been his wife for a few short weeks, this stranger who had irrevocably altered the course of his life, who had, in essence, handed him a death sentence alongside her wedding vows. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, charged with an unbearable tension. Then, he spoke, his voice flat, devoid of inflection, yet carrying the weight of an infinite sorrow and a gathering storm of fury. "Positive," he said, the word dropping into the silence like a stone into a deep, dark well. "I'm HIV positive, Sarah. Thanks to you." The fragile hope in Sarah's eyes shattered, replaced by a look of such profound horror and guilt that, in another lifetime, under different circumstances, Mark might have felt a flicker of pity. But pity was a luxury he could no longer afford. His own life, his own future, had just been consumed by the consequences of her deceit. "Oh, God, Mark, no," she sobbed, her hands flying to her mouth. I prayed you wouldn't be. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Sorry." Mark's voice, no longer flat, began to rise, laced with a dangerous, incredulous fury. "You're sorry. Do you have any idea, any concept, of what you've done? You didn't just lie to me, Sarah. You didn't just betray my trust. You've potentially destroyed my life. Our wedding, our vows, was any of it real? Or was I just a means to an end for you? A convenient cover? Someone to infect before you disappeared?" The accusations, raw and brutal, poured out of him, fueled by weeks of fear, by the fresh, agonizing wound of his own diagnosis. "No, Mark, it wasn't like that," Sarah cried, shrinking back from the intensity of his rage. "I loved you. I still love you. I was a coward. I was terrified. I thought we could have a life, that maybe it wouldn't happen, that you wouldn't get it." Her explanations, her pleas, sounded hollow, self-serving, in the face of the catastrophe she had wrought. "You thought?" Mark advanced on her, his fists clenched, his body trembling with a rage he had never known he possessed. "You didn't think about me, did you? About my health? About the fact that you were playing Russian roulette with my life every time we were intimate?" The husband who had once looked at her with such adoration now saw only the architect of his ruin. The apartment, once filled with their shared laughter and hopeful plans, now felt like a pressure cooker, the atmosphere thick with unspoken resentments, with the acrid stench of betrayal and despair. The argument raged, a torrent of bitter accusations and tearful, inadequate defenses. Mark, his usual calm, rational demeanor shattered, paced the room like a caged animal, his voice rising to a shout as he recounted every lie, every evasion, every moment of her calculated deception. He felt a profound sense of powerlessness, of being trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. His life, his body, his future, none of it felt like his own anymore. It had all been stolen, contaminated by her secret, by her virus. He saw his dreams turning to ash before his very eyes, his career, his hopes of a family, his expectation of a long and healthy old age. All gone. Wiped out. Because of her. Because of this wife who had promised to love and cherish him. Sarah, overwhelmed by his fury and her own crushing guilt, could only offer broken sobs, fragmented apologies that did nothing to quell the inferno of his rage. She tried to reach out to him, to touch his arm, but he recoiled as if from a leper. "Don't touch me," he roared, his eyes blazing. "You've done enough damage." The love he had felt was being systematically burned away, cauterized by the sheer scale of her betrayal and its devastating, life-altering consequences. He was a man pushed to the edge, his sanity fraying, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him. The husband was gone, replaced by a man consumed by a righteous, terrifying fury, a man who felt he had nothing left to lose because everything precious had already been taken from him. The conflict had reached its zenith, the air electric with impending doom. The argument, a raging inferno of Mark's agony and Sarah's desperate, failing attempts at explanation or absolution, had been tearing through their once peaceful apartment for what felt like an eternity. Every piece of furniture, every photograph from their wedding, every shared memento, seemed to mock Mark with the ghost of a happiness that was now irrevocably poisoned. His voice was raw from shouting, his body thrumming with a volatile cocktail of adrenaline, despair, and an all-consuming rage. He saw Sarah, his wife, not as the woman he had loved, but as the very embodiment of his destruction, the wellspring of the HIV that now coursed through his own veins, a permanent, unwelcome guest. He had backed her into a corner of the living room, near the large picture window that overlooked the city skyline, a view they had once admired together, dreaming of their future. Now, it was just a backdrop to a nightmare. Sarah was weeping uncontrollably, her words devolving into incoherent pleas. "Mark, please. I didn't mean for this. I never wanted to hurt you. I just wanted to be loved, to have a normal life, just for a little while." Her words, perhaps intended to elicit sympathy, or to explain the desperation that had led her to such a profound betrayal, had the opposite effect on Mark. "A normal life," he spat, his voice dripping with a venomous sarcasm that was utterly foreign to his nature. "You wanted a normal life? And what about my life, Sarah? Did you ever once stop to think about my life? The life you've stolen from me? The husband you've condemned?" He felt something snap within him, a crucial tether to reason, to restraint, giving way under the intolerable pressure. The carefully constructed dam of his lifelong composure, his innate gentleness, finally burst. It was a single phrase she uttered next, almost a whisper through her sobs, that seemed to be the final, irrevocable trigger. Perhaps it was a denial, a deflection of blame, or even a tragically timed, "It's not just my fault." The exact words would later be debated, lost in the red mist of Mark's fury and the horror of what followed. But whatever she said, in that moment, to Mark, it sounded like the ultimate negation of his suffering, the final, unbearable insult piled upon a mountain of deceit and life-altering harm. He lunged. It wasn't a premeditated act, not in the cold, calculated sense. It was a primal explosion, a complete and utter surrender to the blind, consuming rage that had been building within him since he'd first seen that positive HIV test with her name on it, a rage magnified 1,000-fold by his own subsequent diagnosis. His hands, the same hands that had so tenderly held hers at the altar, the hands of an architect used to creating, to building, were now instruments of destruction. They closed around her throat. Sarah's eyes widened in terror, her choked gasps for air unheard over the roaring in Mark's ears. There was a brief, desperate struggle, her hands clawing at his, her body thrashing. But Mark, fueled by a strength born of unimaginable pain and fury, was relentless. He was no longer Mark Sterling, the rational husband, the gentle lover. He was a raw, exposed nerve of agony, lashing out at the source of his torment. The act itself was horrifyingly swift, yet for Mark, it seemed to unfold in a surreal, distorted slow motion. He was outside himself, watching this monstrous scene unfold, yet trapped within it, his actions driven by a force he no longer controlled. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. Sarah's struggles ceased. Her body went limp in his grasp. He stumbled back, his hands falling to his sides, a horrified gasp tearing from his own lungs as the red mist began to clear, revealing the unspeakable reality of what he had just done. Sarah, his wife, lay crumpled on the floor, her eyes staring blankly at the ceiling, a thin trickle of blood at the corner of her mouth. The silence that descended upon the room was absolute, a terrifying void where moments before there had been screams, accusations, and the sounds of a desperate struggle. Mark stared at her, at his hands, a wave of nausea and self-loathing so profound it threatened to consume him. The rage, so potent, so all-encompassing just seconds earlier, vanished as quickly as it had erupted, leaving behind a chilling, desolate emptiness. What had he done? In a single, cataclysmic moment of lost control, he had extinguished a life, the life of the woman he had once loved, the woman whose betrayal had driven him to this precipice, and now, the woman whose death would define the rest of his own blighted existence. The wedding rings on their fingers, his and hers, glinted mockingly in the dimming afternoon light. The husband had become a killer. The HIV that had poisoned their marriage had now culminated in a crime from which there was no return, no escape, no redemption. The silence of the apartment was no longer just the absence of life, it was the deafening sound of his own damnation. The moments immediately following Sarah's death were a blur of horrifying clarity for Mark Sterling. The adrenaline that had fueled his murderous rage drained away, leaving him cold, trembling, and staring at the lifeless body of his wife with a disbelieving, soul-numbing dread. The vibrant colors of their living room, the carefully chosen artwork, the wedding photos still smiling from the mantelpiece, everything seemed to accuse him, to bear silent witness to the catastrophic violence that had just occurred. He sank to his knees, not in grief for Sarah, not yet, but in a paralytic shock at the enormity of his own actions. He, Mark Sterling, the respected architect, the loving husband, was now a killer. The HIV diagnosis, the betrayal, the loss of his own health, none of it could justify this. It's unclear from the initial reports whether Mark called the authorities himself in a state of dazed confession, or if a neighbor, perhaps hearing the violent crescendo of the argument and then the sudden, chilling silence, made the call. What is known is that within the hour, the pristine quiet of their suburban apartment complex was shattered by the wail of sirens. Police cruisers and an ambulance converged on the building, their flashing lights painting grotesque, dancing shadows on the walls of Mark and Sarah's apartment as officers made their entry. The scene that greeted them was stark and tragic. Sarah Reynolds lay on the living room floor, her life extinguished. Mark Sterling was found sitting on the sofa, staring blankly ahead, his clothes disheveled, his hands stained with faint traces of blood, Sarah's blood. He offered no resistance as he was handcuffed and read his Miranda rights. The husband, now a suspect in the murder of his wife, was escorted from his home, his face a mask of numb despair, caught in the fleeting glare of news cameras that had already begun to gather like vultures. The investigation that followed was, in many ways, straightforward, yet deeply unsettling for the seasoned detectives involved. The crime scene unit meticulously processed the apartment, collecting forensic evidence. An autopsy performed on Sarah Reynolds confirmed the cause of death as asphyxiation due to manual strangulation, with contributing blunt force trauma. Neighbors were interviewed, recounting hearing a violent argument escalate throughout the afternoon. The positive HIV test result belonging to Sarah, and later, evidence of Mark's own recent HIV diagnosis, were discovered, painting a grim picture of a marriage built on a catastrophic secret, a secret that had apparently detonated with lethal force. Mark, during his interrogation, after being provided with legal counsel, reportedly confessed to killing Sarah, his account punctuated by periods of uncontrollable sobbing and profound, incoherent remorse. He spoke of the betrayal, of learning about her HIV status after their wedding, of his own subsequent positive diagnosis, and of the final, explosive argument where he simply snapped. His defense attorney would later attempt to build a case around a plea of temporary insanity or extreme emotional disturbance, arguing that the cumulative trauma of Sarah's deception and the life-altering impact of the HIV infections had pushed Mark beyond the brink of rational control. The trial of Mark Sterling for the murder of his wife, Sarah Reynolds, became a local media sensation, a tragic real-life soap opera that captivated and horrified the community. The prosecution painted Mark as a man who, unable to cope with his wife's illness and his own, had lashed out in a fit of vengeful rage, a husband who had taken the ultimate, unforgivable step. They presented evidence of the ferocity of the attack, arguing it was not a momentary loss of control but a sustained act of violence. The defense, conversely, portrayed Mark as a victim himself, a victim of his wife's profound deceit, a man whose mind had been temporarily unhinged by the devastating one-two punch of learning his new bride had HIV and had infected him. They highlighted his previously unblemished record, his gentle nature, arguing that such an act was utterly out of character and could only be explained by an extreme psychological break. The positive HIV status of both victim and perpetrator hung heavy over the courtroom, a somber testament to the destructive power of secrets and disease. The jury deliberated for 2 days. The community held its breath. When the verdict was finally read, it was unequivocal, guilty of murder in the second degree. While perhaps acknowledging some mitigating circumstances related to the extreme emotional distress, the jury ultimately found that Mark Sterling had intentionally taken his wife's life. The judge, in sentencing Mark, spoke of the profound tragedy of the case, of lives ruined by lies and a final, fatal loss of control. Mark Sterling, the once promising architect, the grieving husband who had become a killer, was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. The gavel fell, sealing his fate, a grim finality to a story that had begun with wedding bells and ended in a blood-soaked nightmare. Justice, in its cold, impartial way, had been served, but for Mark, and for the memory of Sarah, there was only the enduring, desolate landscape of what might have been, and the horrifying reality of what was. Mark Sterling's life, once a carefully constructed edifice of professional success and nascent marital happiness, now exists within the stark, unyielding confines of a maximum security prison. The vibrant blueprints of architectural designs have been replaced by the monotonous gray of concrete walls and steel bars. The loving whispers of his wife, Sarah, even the furious, pain-filled shouts of their final, fatal argument, have faded, superseded by the cacophony of prison life, the clang of cell doors, the disembodied voices over intercoms, the ever-present undercurrent of tension and despair. He is no longer Mark Sterling, husband and architect. He is inmate number 73402, serving a life sentence for the murder of the woman he had vowed to cherish, the woman whose secret, her hidden HIV status, a truth concealed until after their wedding, had ignited a chain reaction of devastation that consumed them both. From the desolate vantage point of his prison cell, Mark has had years, decades even, to reflect on the maelstrom of events that led him here. The initial joy of his marriage, the horrifying discovery of Sarah's illness, the crushing blow of his own positive HIV diagnosis, and the final, unforgivable explosion of rage that resulted in her death. There are no easy answers, no simple explanations for how a love story could curdle into such a profound tragedy. He lives with the crushing weight of his actions, the knowledge that he took a human life, the life of someone he had loved, however complex and ultimately betrayed that love had become. The husband who felt his life was over when he received his diagnosis now faces a different kind of life sentence, one measured not just by the progression of a virus, but by the endless, unchanging days behind bars, haunted by the ghosts of what was, and what could never be. The narrator might pause here, allowing the grim reality of Mark's situation to settle, before continuing in that steady, analytical tone. The case of Mark and Sarah Sterling is a harrowing illustration of how secrets, especially those concerning health and trust within the most intimate of relationships, can fester and ultimately erupt with catastrophic consequences. Sarah's decision to conceal her HIV status from Mark before their wedding, whatever her motivations, fear, shame, a desperate desire for a semblance of normalcy, was a profound betrayal, one that set in motion an unstoppable tragedy. It robbed Mark of his right to informed consent, to make choices about his own health and his own life. And Mark's reaction, while fueled by an unimaginable confluence of shock, grief, betrayal, and the terror of his own infection, serves as a terrifying reminder of how quickly the veneer of civilization can be stripped away, how easily human beings can be pushed beyond their limits when confronted with extreme emotional distress. His violent act, born of despair and rage, was a final, irreversible surrender to the darkness that had enveloped him. This tragic story underscores a painful, fundamental truth: honesty and open communication are the bedrock of any healthy relationship. Concealing a serious health condition like HIV not only endangers a partner physically but also constitutes a deep emotional and psychological violation. It creates a foundation of lies that, inevitably, will crumble, often with devastating repercussions for everyone involved. Furthermore, it highlights the critical importance of seeking help, of finding healthy ways to manage overwhelming emotions, especially anger and despair. Mark's inability to control his rage in that final, fatal moment, understandable though the provocation may have been in the eyes of some, led to an outcome that offered no solace, no justice, only more pain and ruined lives. The legal system delivered its verdict, but the moral complexities of the case continue to resonate, posing difficult questions about blame, responsibility, and the breaking point of the human psyche. What, then, are we to take away from the wreckage of Mark and Sarah Sterling's shattered lives? Perhaps it is a renewed understanding of the profound responsibility we have to one another in intimate partnerships, a responsibility to be truthful, especially when it comes to matters that can irrevocably alter a life. Perhaps it is a reminder of the insidious nature of stigma, the fear that can drive individuals to make desperate, damaging choices. Or perhaps it is simply a somber acknowledgement of human frailty, of the devastating consequences that can unfold when love turns to betrayal, and grief to murderous rage. The husband sits in his prison cell, the wife lies in her grave, their wedding vows a distant, mocking echo. The HIV virus, the silent catalyst, continues its insidious work in Mark's body, a constant reminder of the secret that destroyed everything. As we conclude this account, we are left with lingering, uncomfortable questions. Could this tragedy have been averted? If Sarah had been honest from the start, could Mark have found a path to forgiveness, to shared coping, or at least to a separation without violence? If Mark had sought help in managing his overwhelming grief and rage, could he have avoided that final, fatal act? There are no easy answers, only the grim reality of two lives extinguished, one by disease and deception, the other by violence and a lifetime of incarceration. A beat of silence, then, in a slightly more direct, but still calm, tone for the call to action. The stories we explore here often delve into the most challenging aspects of human behavior and the devastating consequences of choices made in moments of crisis. If you find these examinations of true events compelling, and wish to understand more about the intricate dynamics that can lead to such tragic outcomes, please consider subscribing to our channel and enabling notifications. Join us as we continue to seek understanding in the aftermath of the unthinkable.